It was slow today. There we go. This bad boy out. Oops. Hello there, Hawkeye fans, and welcome to the Hawkeye Hotspot podcast here on hawkfanatic.com. I am Rob Howe. That is Scott Docterman. If you're watching us on the YouTube stream, or if you're listening to us later on the podcast, Scott is from The Athletic. We switched this. We are normally on Thursdays, but this is Tuesday. You're not wrong. We flip-flopped the mailbag and the hotspot this week. One, I forgot to tweet out solicitation of questions for the mailbag last night because I was watching women's basketball and completely spaced it out. So I had to do that this morning, and gives us a couple extra days to get tickets or questions in there. And Scott is traveling, and Thursday is the women's basketball press day at the Final Four in Cleveland that Scott will be at. So this just worked out better logistically for us to do this today. And we've got plenty to talk about after last night's wonderful game and wonderful night for women's basketball, for college basketball, for sports. It's a lot, Scott. We're kind of going through history here. This feels like, 10, 20 years down the road, people are going to remember what we're seeing now.
No question. This is an inflection point in history. When you saw last night the two games, the double headers, and the stars that were in every single one of the games, and arguably any of those stars are bigger than what we see in men's basketball at this point. Zach Edey's probably for the casual fan anyway.
Yeah, I was going to say Edey's probably the only one that you could name that would be in with that, that foursome that played last night.
Right. And that's because he's the National Player of the Year and came back, and his profile is a lot like that of Luka Garza, where he's not going to be a lottery pick, and he came back to school, and I'm sure he got some good bank there at Purdue. But when you look at the women's game and how long they're staying in school, and you have Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese and Paige Beckers and Juju Watkins all competing for the chance to go to the Final Four, that's rich in storylines, and ESPN had it all. And I thought they did a tremendous job in promoting it. I thought the officiating was really good. I think they let them play, and overall, to watch what was a matchup of the millennium, and it was tied 45-45 at halftime. And then for Iowa and Caitlin Clark to really push through in the second half, I'm trying to mentally adjust. Where does this fit in the big picture for Iowa basketball, Iowa sports, women's basketball? And I don't think it's hyperbolic to say that might be the biggest win in Iowa sports history, even above last year with South Carolina. And maybe I need to take a step back and think about that a little bit. But when you consider the opponent, what the opponent did to you last year, and then to come back and put it on this stage, it's as big as it gets. And I think it's something that, we in men's basketball, we always talk about the Indiana State, Michigan State game in '79. And this feels like it could be on that same trajectory.
Yeah, that same thought had crossed my mind, and you and I are old enough to remember that that game, the Michigan State Indiana State game, and the impact that it had on the future. And I think that's why I tend to agree with what you're saying, Scott. I don't think it's hyperbolic to rank last night's game at the top just because of the progress just in the last 12 months since the last time they played, the sport has made. And it was getting big then, but the progress in the last 12 months has just been meteoric. I mean, the rise has been crazy.
You look at Iowa specifically, because we cover Iowa and we can see it up close. I mean, of the 37 games, 35 have been sellouts. That doesn't count 56,000 climbing into Kinnick Stadium on a mid-October day. And the eyeballs and the attention. I mean, they go on the road, they're the Beatles, especially Caitlin Clark, and every time they could give into the pressure, and in every situation. And last night being as high profile as any game they played, including last year's game, and yet to come through and win, and win decisively. Multiple possessions, 3-possession game, I think really speaks to that this was, a huge moment. I mean, there's so many directions we're going to go to on this, but yeah. I think in the big picture, for what Iowa was put up here after they lost the national title game and continued to climb, and the popularity continued to climb, and you saw that the numbers, the television ratings of all these networks, the highest rated game here, highest rated game here, highest rated game Fox, all the way now to, wow, what are the numbers going to be after last night? I mean, we're talking about, for the Sweet 16, there was more than 6 million people who tuned in for Iowa, Colorado. Now it was on ABC, but come on, most households have ESPN if they're watching TV at all. What's the last night's number? It's going to approach last year's championship game number of 9.9 million. It wouldn't surprise. I would be surprised if it's less than 8.5 million, but probably more than between 9 and 10 million. That's just unbelievable compared to where we were even 3 years ago when they were in a bubble and they had a weight room the size of what you get at most Holiday Inns. It's just remarkable how meteoric the rise has been, and then it's certainly in the last 12 months.
And we could pop this in now. We were talking about before we started recording, just the context of, again, we cover Iowa, so we have a familiarity with the landscape around here. And it's April 2nd. And most years around here, that's spring football. That's, and it's not like we're ignoring it. How's Kate McNamara doing? How's Tim Lester, the installation of the new offense, doing? And people are talking about that, but not to the level we normally do. And that's because of the Iowa women's basketball team. It's almost like, and maybe it's not almost like, it is like, people are like, we'll talk about spring football after this women's basketball season concludes. But for right now, the focus is clear. And that's on, as we talked about, the historic, just how historic this run is. And again, from the last 12 months to where it was last year when they left that court in Dallas, and Angel Reese is doing this and the finger and all that, and how it's built up to this again, and it continues to grow. And we'll see, when Angel Reese and Caitlin Clark and Cameron Brink and all these kids go into the WNBA now, and Paige has said she's coming back next year, but this we're on the ride now, Scott. This is the ride, and we'll see where it goes.
Right. For all that, there still are people. There's one prominent person on Twitter who thinks that Caitlin Clark made a mistake or whatever by not coming back to Iowa. I think it's ridiculous at this point, but they're going to take their star to the next level. Angel Reese was a phenomenal player, and she was phenomenal last night. Now ultimately her numbers weren't great from shooting from the floor, especially from where she shot. However, with 17 points and 20 rebounds, that's a pretty damn good day. She was dominant when she was in there before she got hurt.
And she's and defensively in the middle, yeah, she's a problem.
Yeah, she caused some issues. But then you look at the other side. I mean, Caitlin Clark and what she was able to do again. Last year in the Elite Eight against Louisville, 41 points, triple-double. Last night against Louisiana State University, LSU, 41 points, a double-double, and damn near a triple-double against a much better team. And it's, I think that, what I'm kind of writing about right now that's publishes later today and is, Iowa historically has every time I don't count wrestling in this because wrestling's more niche than it is national, but of the primary national sports, every time Iowa gets so close, it just can't push through. in traditionally, in whether it's, and I list all the events, the 87 Elite Eight when they're up 20 on UNLV and fall short, the game against Michigan State and the Big Ten championship, that goes on and on and on and on. We all know what they are. And I'm sure even to some people, it's too soon when you mention them. But for this women's basketball team to go to the national title in Iowa history, those teams sometimes fall short the next year, that would they fail to live up to the hype. I think of 2010 Iowa football, because after the year before they won the Orange Bowl, everybody's returning, and then they lost a lot of close games, and we've seen that with basketball repeatedly. This team lived up to the hype and exceeded it. It met the moment and it took it to another level. That's something we've never experienced before here, and frankly, we know why. It's number 22. She's the greatest to ever wear an Iowa uniform of any sport. And she's the most, we're baseball fans, old school baseball fans. Nobody's talking baseball right now. We've covered or watched or, enjoyed the NCAA men's tournament for years and years. And it's great. But the talk about nationally, let alone locally, is women's basketball. Something we've never experienced before. And frankly, it's because of number 22. She's taken it to another level that the sport has never accomplished before, and Iowa sports have never met.
And I think we're kind of seeing that realization with some of the game's most successful coaches, Kim Mulkey, Gino. They're acknowledging that, and Gino backpedaled a little bit, but I mean, of course he's going to say his kid's the best.
Yeah.
I mean, I have no problem with that at all, but I think they have the realization now that this is something different than they've had to face before in Caitlin Clark, and that I think there's some at least relief on their part that this is it for her, and Kim said this last night, that they won't have to face her in the future, and this is kind of like, the eclipse, so to speak, or something rare. But that's the thing that opposing coaches need to deal with now. It was obvious last night and it backfired. But Kim Mulkey basically was like, she's going to get hers. We have to figure out how to take the other kids out. And that's one approach when you face Iowa, is do what you can against Caitlin, but make sure the others don't get theirs. Well, last night, Kate Martland got 21, Sydney Falter got 16, and there were other kids that made big baskets at big moments. So that's kind of the approach with Iowa. What do you do? And putting Haley Van Lith on Caitlin was not a good decision. I don't know what the game plan was for LSU, but it wasn't good. And then Iowa countered that game plan by executing its game plan. And that was kind of the story for me of last night. And the other thing is, it's pretty obvious that Caitlin's locked in. She let her emotions get to her a little bit in the first couple rounds. It being the last time playing in Carver Hawkeye Arena, I think kind of fed into that a little bit. And then what we all saw with her dad telling her to stop. I was super impressed with how the last two games, you could see a few times where she almost started with, that was a foul, complaining about a call. She let it go, Scott. She just moved on to the next play. That's bad news for the opponents. When she's locked in like that, I don't know, man. I don't know how you beat her.
Yeah, I thought for the first time in her career that the pressure got to her that opening weekend at Carver Hawkeye Arena. And, I mean, they're playing a 16 seed in Holy Cross, and, they're going to win this game going away, which they did. Maybe not as decisively as they'd hoped. They didn't play real well.
No.
And they looked tight, not necessarily the pressure got to them as much as, you feel a responsibility. You're at home. And this crowd is so crazy and intense, both games, but certainly the second one was against West Virginia. And then you're playing against a team like West Virginia that was so physical. That's really the only way you can get her out of her game. And they were they were a difficult matchup. But I think once they got out of Iowa City and were able to kind of, they still had a pro Iowa crowd behind them, but it wasn't like it is in Iowa City. That I think it allowed them to relax a little bit, and you could see that she's enjoying this, and that's really helpful for her in Iowa and really bad for the opponent, because it's funny. Lisa's mentioned it that she doesn't feel pressure. Then that's rare, because there are a lot of players who get in these key moments, these key situations, that just can't get it done. And she seems to thrive, to relish those moments, and I mean, poor Haley Van Lith. I mean, last year she was at Louisville and she was talking a lot of smack in that game, and was kind of the recipient of some backlash from Caitlin, and then she goes to LSU thinking that that's going to be a super team, and lo and behold, I mean, she goes 2 of 10, 1 of 6 from 3, and just got brutalized on the defensive side of things. I mean, she was minus 15, by far the worst of any player on the floor, and she just looked, like, yeah, I hate to say it, but it wasn't a real good look for her. But one of the things that Lisa also answered this morning in a news conference was, and I think Jeff Linder asked the question, does she feel vindicated a little bit by not going to the portal, not getting a big post? Because we all talked about it. I know I did, that this is a moment that if it backfires, there's going to be a lot of heat on it, and it's deserved. And yet she's like, we were just looking for specifics, something very narrow for this position, and we want to make sure that somebody can fit when they get here, and we just didn't find it. And even though they've struggled in the post, and last night was a nightmare scenario with Hannah Stolke getting foul trouble early and often, they're still able to weather it. It was this is a remarkable team.
Yeah, and we'll see, because I obviously Connecticut is not as long and tall as some of the other teams Iowa's had to get through. Even Colorado had good length and size. But last night was another example of them being able to meet that challenge. If it does get to South Carolina and Camille Cardoza, then, and you don't win it all, then people will be like, we needed a post. But somebody like Lauren Betts, I mean, that would have been a great fit, but she's Californian. She wanted to stay in California. And you don't want to just take a body to put a body in there. And, but it's to Addie O'Grady last night. She had some hiccups early, but kind of settled in and accounted really well for herself. And that's really what you need from her, Scott, is just some post minutes, especially when Hannah's in foul trouble. You need some post minutes. And even AJ Edinger got in there and was like, all right, they didn't look intimidated. And that's what you want to see, especially at this point of the season when so much is on the line.
Right. I think and this is the difference between them and the fans, is maybe that there was some PTSD from last year's game against LSU, and almost an intimidating factor that, I can't believe we got to play them. The players didn't feel that way, and AJ Edinger doesn't necessarily look like she should compete against them, but she went out and did her best. She played hard. And Addison O'Grady, the same thing. I mean, late in the half, she had some big moments. She was able to hit a jumper. She was able to cause a foul with Angel Reese, and, things like that. That just, and that's what they really need out of that position. Especially when Hannah Stolke's down, is kind of like the old Chicago Bulls with Hack-a-Shack. Hey, we've got 3 guys who, Will Perdue and Bill Wennington and Luke Longley, and they're not going to equal one Shaq, but we've got 18 fouls to give. And that's, in some ways that you just go in, eat up some minutes, don't do anything negative. If you got a foul, make sure they don't make the bucket too. Excuse me. And so I think overall, when you see that, that's a plus. And, the post isn't going to matter as much on Friday. Maybe they still could lose, of course, but I don't think it's going to be because they were beaten down in the post. But yes, South Carolina poses a problem, and you know what? Yeah, they posed a problem with everybody. They're outstanding. They're outstanding last year. They're undefeated. They aren't invincible, but they are the best team in the country. It's going to take an effort that Iowa is going to have to play its best basketball.
NC State's got some big kids too. I don't know if people have caught them, but that's another team that, should NC State pull off that upset, there's size to deal with there. And it was, you don't see a team getting out rebounded, Scott, 54-36 and still winning by 3 possessions, which Iowa did last night. Iowa got worked on the backboards. However, if you look at what the result of that is second chance points. LSU only scored 14 second chance points off of 23 offensive rebounds. So Iowa did a good job, even when giving up those boards, of hanging in there and trying to keep defending. And that's not always easy to do. They can be really deflating when you're getting whooped on the backboards like that. And I think Lisa talked about it at the end of the third quarter, maybe when Holly Rowe interviewed her, how concerned she was with that. But give Iowa credit. They overcame a statistical anomaly there to be able to win the game.
Angel Reese had a double-double in rebounds, offensive and defensive. She had 20 total, 10 on each side. And it's hard to overcome that. You're out, when it comes to offensive rebounds, it's 23-6. But as you said, and said well, is, a lot of times those are 3, opportunity. Three offensive rebounds in a possession, which again is demoralizing, but it's also impactful if you hang in there and don't let it affect you. And they didn't. It was like, okay, we know this is an area that's going to be tough for us, but just don't get demoralized. Allow, if they score, we'll move on. We can score too. And as you said, this, you look at Angel in particular, but also Anissa Morrow. They were 14 of 39 from the floor, and they're the ones closest to the basket. And you didn't have your post in there for for half of a game, basically because you fouled out. You feel pretty good about that, because if you got a couple of pros, in there, and you're hanging in there and battling, that's something to take away and feel pretty good about yourselves.
Yeah, no doubt. And obviously the interior challenge won't be as much with UConn as it was with LSU, but obviously UConn has a star of its own, and we'll get to that in a minute. Let's take a break. How about that? Let me try to get to a read that I don't have pulled up, but will in a second, hopefully. Yeah, I'm not awake yet. Support for this podcast comes from Systems Unlimited, celebrating 50 years of providing services to people living with disabilities and mental health needs throughout East Central Iowa. A list of their services and upcoming events can be found at sui.org. That is sui.org. Thank you to Systems Unlimited for the support of the podcast, and especially for the great work they've done in the community for over half a century. Thank you to Systems Unlimited. We're going to hear from a few more sponsors right now, and Scott and I will be back on the other side to look ahead to what's going to happen in Cleveland. And we'll do that in a few. Hang in there. And we are back to let you know that switching is easy. We do it all the time. We switch on the lights, we switch TV channels. Some of us switch partners while square dancing. Well, that's a stretch. But what's not a stretch is how you can switch and save with State Farm. In fact, State Farm agent Chad Birch right here in Iowa City can switch you over so you can start saving today. Chad and his team are ready to welcome you to the State Farm neighborhood. With Chad Birch, it's easy to switch and save. Just give him a call when you want the real deal, like a good neighbor. State Farm is there. I wrote last night, Scott, that last night was kind of like, if Iowa does end up winning it all, last night was one of those chapters that's especially juicy, right? In the book, in the storybook finish, if it happens. They got revenge against an LSU team that, let's face it, Caitlin had to feel like crap when Angel did that to her last year, walking off the court. And I think those memories, we talk about it often, and sometimes it can be cliche, but the drive to get back there. And I know Caitlin was saying it wasn't revenge and any of that. That had to feel great. That had to feel great to beat that LSU team along the way on this journey. Now you get one of the bluest of blue bloods in UConn, if not the bluest. Tennessee. There's a lot of really good programs in the history of college basketball, but UConn is the top of the mountain. It is. And this is not a great Utah team or UConn team, which is kind of scary. They're kind of grinding wins out, and it makes for a really intriguing matchup in the Final Four. And this would be another wonderful, intriguing, interesting chapter in the book if you're able to beat UConn on the way to winning it all.
You're looking at two teams that are a lot alike, in a lot of areas. I mean, I just went through and kind of plotted out, just primary statistics and, rebounding margin. Iowa's actually better than they are, +7 versus +5.5. Assist to turnover ratio is real comparable. They shoot about the same from three and from the floor. 3-point percent per game is different. Iowa's at 11, they're at 7 per game, but really, numbers wise, they're pretty similar. And then when you look at who's directing traffic, you've got two of the brightest stars, if not the two brightest stars, upper echelon at that position group. And Gino picked Paige Beckers over Caitlin Clark. There's no doubt that was the case. Now, we could also look back, and a lot of times it's like for the best for both of them. Now I'm not talking about injuries to Paige Beckers. That's been horrible, but she's played within his system. She's an outstanding player. She'll be a great pro for a long, long time, just like Sue Bird and all the others. Dinah Taurasi, but Caitlin Clark probably wouldn't have the freedom that she has at Iowa at a place like UConn, where she'd have to play within a system and not have that ability to just do what she kind of wants to because Lisa gives it to her. So, and ultimately, it maybe that rejection motivates her, and for elite players, they need to find motivations, and if this is one, then it's one, and it works, but at the same time, she's, this is great for the game as well. I mean, because you got an elite brand, as you said, Tennessee's fallen off since Pat Summitt, is, passed. And then, they fired their coach yesterday for having a decent run, but not a, Tennessee-esque run. Iowa is, has the biggest brand in sports right now in Caitlin Clark, and how much money that this has made the University of Iowa from a promotional standpoint, we'll never know. And then you get, tight end you eventually, you will return maybe at the end of the draft. But overall, you just can't ask for, a better matchup. And that's why it last night, the reason why I think Iowa LSU went early was because it was a Monday night. And their game was in Albany, the other game was in Portland. Mm-hmm. And so it just made sense to kind of flow it that way and get those early ratings. Well, on Friday, where it's a Friday night, you move the Iowa game to prime time. against UConn, and that's what makes the most sense. So so it's got the key booking, and then the only unfortunate part is it's Sunday afternoon. Now it's fortunate for me and you and all the other writers, but as far as for the fans and for the sport, you'd always want that to be like Super Bowl timeline.
It's interesting, Scott, looking back at the 2020 Hoop Girls recruiting rankings on ESPNW, the 100. These are pretty much the most consistent rankings year to year. They do the best job with women's basketball recruiting rankings. And those rankings went like this: Paige Beckers 1, Angel Reese 2, Cameron Brink 3, Caitlin Clark 4, Camila Cardoza 5. I think those kids have lived up to the hype.
Yeah, they nailed it. I mean, you could argue,
Van Lith was 7th, by the way.
That was she, yeah. Who's 6th? That's like
6th was Diamond Johnson.
Okay, she was good too.
And Sydney Parrish was 8, Priscilla Williams was 9, and Deja Kelly was 10. So one heck of a class, man.
Yeah, it's probably the most impactful class and we've ever seen. And when you look at the trajectory of what they went through that first year with COVID, there were cutouts of Sparkle the cat and Bella the dog at Carver Hawkeye Arena. To now where, you want to get a ticket there, you better have some bank, for this. It's really remarkable. But yeah, that class is probably the one that will propel this sport into a new age. It already has, but it'll be one that you look back on and you go, whoa, kind of there's some of those, especially like with NFL and the NFL draft, that kind of fit that role. I would say like the 89 top of the draft were Troy Aikman. And then the third pick was Barry Sanders. Then it was Derek Thomas and then Deion Sanders. 4 out of the top 5 are Hall of Famers, and the 5th was Tony Mandarich, or the 83 quarterback class. And, just there's some that just, wow. And that's what this is at the collegiate level.
I like that they're doing it. This group is doing it with their chest out. Yeah. They're not being what I think men particularly wanted women's athletes to be docile and just, play the game and don't trash talk and be nice and all that. They're not nice, and they talk trash and they celebrate and they drop F-bombs and all that stuff. And I submit that that's been part of the rise in the popularity, that they compete as hard as anybody. And that's the way it should be.
Yeah, Rob, you look at those players and they all went to different universities throughout the whole country. And, now Angel, of course, transferred from Maryland to LSU. But, I think on a holistic scale, culturally, Angel Reese and Caitlin Clark have changed the game unlike anybody else. And because, you look at the pictures of what games are like, the one that always stands out for me is Northwestern. When Iowa went there, a place where if you got a couple hundred people for a women's basketball game, you're having a good night. And, I think it was ABC7 in Chicago, did interviews outside, and you saw 14-year-old and 15-year-old girls who played middle school basketball, and they were screaming like, "Oh, I gotta see Caitlin Clark," and that's a cultural movement that they brought that wasn't there before, whether they were those girls were ignored or just patronized. It's really kind of all one and the same. But now, hey, I could be like Caitlin Clark. I look like Caitlin Clark. I live in the suburbs of Chicago. I live in the Des Moines metro area or Cedar Rapids, and I can play like her and be proud of who I am and raise my arms and yell and sometimes say bad words. And, it's not like a little girl, go sit over there, let the big boys play. They are the big boys. And that's pretty cool to see, because they're at the forefront of sports revolution, that it's organic. I mean, we could say that, yeah, more media coverage has helped, but people have to want it in order for there to be media coverage. It works in tandem, because if people aren't going to events, if they're not talking about events, we're going to default to football, men's basketball at the college level. But when there's this much popularity, it's like, yeah, I got to write about this. I could choose what I want to write, but when every story is hitting our trending storyline related to women's basketball, you got to lean into that. And that's on them for making it that way.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. The public wants it, right? That's when the media gives it to them, is when the public calls for it, with TV ratings and all the other stuff, driving traffic, clicks, for lack of a better term. And it's not like those old UConn Tennessee games with Gino against Pat Summitt weren't some of the greatest players that have ever played this game. And there have been such, you talked about the UConn with Sue Bird and, Diana Taurasi and Brianna Stewart and Maya Moore, and go down the list. From, Shamika Holsclaw to, all the great players that have been at Tennessee through the years, and all the other programs with Cheryl Miller and, Lisa Leslie. Just, there have been so many, but for whatever reason, and Caitlin and Angel and Paige, and they all deserve a ton of credit for lifting it up where it is now. It's because the public is ready for it too. The public wants it. And that's cool, because this sport has been waiting for this for a long time and has a lot of great players and an awesome history.
I hope this doesn't come across controversial, but I think it was the confluence of two major events that allowed some sort of growth, organic growth in this. One is the Me Too movement, because there are a lot of women that decided we're going to support women in every way, shape, or form, because unfortunately, way too many have been subjected to whether it's outright assault or discrimination or what have you. So there's been
it's still happening too. Angel was talking about that last night. The LSU kids were playing about, and that's part of when you raise the popularity, you're going to get bullshit like that. Like the men do on social media with people acting like asses. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. And so there's all of that. But I think that there are a lot of women, and some of it is the benefits of the younger group, but I think a lot of women in their middle age said, we're going to own this. We're going to see it through. The second part is COVID, because when everything flatlined in 2020 for sports, there was no sports, no baseball, and then they had to start building it from ground zero, which was no audiences or, no attendance. And next thing you know, you've got a chance to just rewrite the interest level of sports. And when you look comparatively, I think baseball is really struggling because it didn't promote its stars. The stars there's a few of them, but it hasn't elevated the sport, enough. I think men's basketball is kind of, even though they had great ratings the other day, and it'll bounce back. But
it's been a great tournament too.
Yeah.
There's room for both.
Right. I also, the fact that women could cultivate these stars and keep them engaged for several years under that brand has allowed it to flourish. Whereas men's basketball, you got the one and dones, and you got, it's like, hey, this guy's great. Now he's off to the NBA. And then with the NBA part of it, the NBA draft, I mean, how many of these guys coming up played, across overseas, or played even G League, avoided playing college basketball altogether. And then when your most popular star is like a Zach Edey, who's he might be like 25th pick in the draft, it's not the same. And whereas people are just fighting to say, okay, who can get, Caitlin Clark. So I think that's part of the confluence of those two events rewrote the trajectory of basketball and all sports. Football is more popular than it's ever been because it's football. but women's basketball is just grown leaps and bounds, and part of the Me Too, byproducts are what happened in San Antonio when you've got an Oregon player taking a video saying, look at what we've got. Look at the food that the men have in Indianapolis. Look at their weight facility versus what we have. And we're treated like this. And then there were enough people who said, enough, fuck this bullshit. We're going forward. We're going to make this happen. And then that's what that's why we've seen, a more, hey, we need better TV coverage. We need better this. And they made it happen. You can say it all you want, but they've made it happen. And now at this point in history, it's the most popular sporting event in the country right now. That'll change in a couple of weeks, but for right now, men's and women's basketball, but the women's tournament's commanding most of the attention.
And it's helped that some of the Neanderthals have given in because they've fought it's not entertaining. It's not real basketball. They don't play above the rim. All the excuses for not watching the game. Whereas if you would have just given it a chance in the first place, you would have understood how entertaining the game is and how really good some of these players are. A lot of these players are. And that's good to see. But it takes that confluence that you talked about, Scott. I think gambling has helped.
Oh, yeah,
I think people that are now, with the legalization of gambling in a lot of states and the ability to pull up that app and bet on these games too, and player props and all that. I know there's a dark side or a downside to that, but it also helps popularity. We've seen what that's done for the NFL.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it cost some people some eligibility in this state, which is another story altogether. But
hopefully, nobody was betting on last night's game over on campus.
Yeah, right. I would imagine that there's no geofencing going on right now. But it is remarkable that they've had this, that they've been able to capitalize on it, and you've had the right personalities. Because they do have personality. They have, they are interesting people. People like watching them. I know that, there's the Neanderthals. Nobody watches women's sport. No, you know what? They do. They watch them. And the other part is, okay, they can't jump, they can't dunk. Well, they play it. I would argue that in women's basketball, the passing and the shooting is more precise.
Yep.
And it's because they're smaller, that there's more court. So there's more ability for the ball to get to where it needs to go. Men's basketball, tremendous athletes. I don't think the purest of athletes probably play basketball because the speed, the precision, the skill, and the jumping ability all come into play. And it's just a phenomenal, beautiful game to watch. But with women's basketball, the precision that it takes to pass and to shoot, and then Caitlin has an element that nobody else has ever had, except maybe Steph Curry, which is just accuracy at such incredible distances. And when you can hit those shots with regularity, she hit 4 in the third quarter, 3 straight at one point or something. That's otherworldly. That's a skill that nobody has, men or women. And for her to do it consistently now for 4 years is just, that's why it's in part why she's so popular. And, it's too bad that she couldn't throw a football last fall. Iowa might have been able to get to the playoff, right?
And I think, as you mentioned earlier, what the women's game has going for it is that the players play together for longer. There's no one and dones. A lot of the good teams, they have kids that have been together for several years, and you can see that continuity and flow on the court. We saw that last night. Where your teammate's going to be. There's a lot to be said for that. And from an Iowa perspective, Scott, I think we probably should talk about the head coach. Remarkable. Year 23 and 24, making it to the Final Four. And we see so often around the country where schools get frustrated and act without thinking about, all the factors that go into winning and getting to this level. And Iowa does a good job in showing faith in its coaches and believing in their ability to continue to raise the level of the program. And I've probably told this story on this podcast before. I know I've written about it, but I remember sitting in Lisa Bluder's office had to be, I don't know, somewhere 2008, 9, 10, somewhere in there, where after that initial class she had from Angie Lee of, Kara Consuegra and Lindsay Meter and Randy Peterson and Jenny Lillis and that group that was good. She kind of was stuck in neutral, for lack of a better term. And there were people around here wondering if she could take this program to the level it's at now. And I remember she was not happy with me for answering the question, but she said, it's kind of a process and there's a lot that goes into it. And we've seen her steadily build this through the years. And she's had superstar players from, Sam Logic to Ali Disterhoff to, getting into that second part of her career at Iowa. Sometimes it takes a little time, Scott, to figure it out and figure out what works best for you. And they've been able to do that. Not only Lisa, but, Jan and Jenny Fitzgerald, the two that have been with her the longest, to Raina Harmon, to the other girls that are women that are on her staff that played for her. It's just kind of gotten here. And she'd be the first to tell you this level is achieved because of Caitlin Clark. Yeah. They'd be good without her, but it's cool to see her have that superstar from in-state and be able to take this program to where it is now. Sorry, that was long-winded, but I had to get off my chest.
You're exactly right. I mean, in fact, when you look at, Caitlin Clark is the reason for this success, but Lisa Bluder provided the environment for Caitlin Clark to flourish. And Lisa Bluder has been a solid figure for a long, long time. I remember exactly what you're talking about because I was sitting right next to John Reel, who covered the team for so many years, and he was dealing with a lot of those questions. And when you're going to the tournament, but you're losing, it's a lot like what we're talking about with men's basketball, frankly, that you're like, well, yeah, they're winning, they're graduating great players. And, you've got Cash Alexander and you've got, Christy Smith and Wendy Oddsdemore and Joanne Hamlin and all these really good players, although Cash was fantastic. She was an All-American caliber player, but you're not going to the next level. And, what about C. Vivian Stringer? She was better. Nobody's saying that now. She's the most popular. She could run for governor in the state and win. She's, and what Jan Jensen always said, that everybody in this state thinks like they can sit down and have a cup of coffee with Lisa Bluder, and she's got that kind of aura. But she plays a great style of basketball that people want to watch. It's up and down the floor, and she allows her players to play to that style, and then she tweaks it for her best player, Cash Alexander, Sam Logic, Ali Disterhoff, Megan Gustafson, Kathleen Doyle, now Caitlin Clark. She'll be that way with Addison Deal and Madden Greenway. Ooh, I didn't need to say that.
That was Scott that said that.
Yeah, I was kidding, guys. but she's going to be that way in the future too. And she's now, when I was in Indianapolis for the combine, I was walking, and walking next to me was Stacey Dales, who obviously is a Hall of Famer for Oklahoma. Fantastic player. She's with NFL Network. And I just kind of looked over. I said, you know what? I'd love to get your impressions of Caitlin Clark. And so we talked for quite a while, actually, on our stretch. And one of the things she just turned to me and she goes, I'm really happy for Lisa Bluder because this really allows her to be known as a great coach. I've always thought she was a great coach. And I think that too, that, for all these years, nobody's had a bad impression in the media of Lisa Bluder. We've all liked her, and we all like Jan. We've loved the players that they've brought here. But now that they're winning at a high level, one picture that stands out to me that I took was last during the Classic at Kinnick or whatever. And people were chanting her name when she was getting ready to walk in that football tunnel. She just looks up. She's like this, like she was so appreciative And to see, she's got the perfect career arc from the ground zero. She did not play in the NCAA because the NCAA didn't recognize women's sports. And her first job was at St. Ambrose. And I guarantee, other than parents and a few friends, that those gyms were as empty as they could possibly be. And yet she's climbing now to where it's the most popular sport in the country this very minute. And she has the most popular and recognizable face on her team. It's a true journey that we've never seen. And I think she deserves all the credit in the world.
And I submit an early season decision this year has potentially changed the path of this team. They came into the season thinking, okay, we've been successful with that traditional post player. Yeah. And we're going to start the season with Hannah at the 4 and then a post player, whether it be Sharon Goodman or Addie O'Grady. It wasn't working as well as they wanted it to. Insert Molly Davis, go 4 guards with Hannah, change kind of the style you're playing. Molly gets hurt, you bring in Sydney Falter and work around her skill set as well. That's not easy to do. That's not easy to say. You're in your comfort zone. It's not easy to get out of that comfort zone and go with something that's different. And she's played different styles. As Scott said, she's had different stars through the years. But recently, with that run of Gustafson and Sonano having that dominant post, sometimes it's hard to get away from that. She did, and the team has benefited from it.
Well, yeah, and it's like she said earlier this morning that, they could have taken anybody. I mean, almost any player would have loved to have played with Caitlin Clark, considering you look at Monica Zanano's numbers, 2,500 points roughly, close to it, or, well, not that many. I mean, 2,000 points that she had at Iowa that, hey, she feeds the post. She leads the country in assists and she scores. I could go in there and play. But it was about fit and specific fit. And she decided, you know what, I'm going to be stubborn on this one and not go after just somebody to get somebody in there. And then to have the wherewithal to admit that it's just not working this way and to go to a 4-guard lineup and then lead the country in scoring and decide they're going to have to match our pace. And then, when one of that player, Molly Davis, who was terrific, got hurt, and then to stick in Sydney Falter, kind of hurt your depth a little bit, but also, she changes the game by the way she plays. She's like that, we always talk about some dude at the Y that just doesn't look like he's going to be a guy, he's like 6'2", but he can do everything on the floor. And that's kind of Sydney Falter. She's 5'11". You want her in the post, she'll bang with you. She'll shoot 3. She'll bring the ball up. She'll drive with her left hand and score at the basket. I mean, Lisa, she just tailors everything towards her players. She's got a certain style she wants to play with, but it's not so rigid that it, we're going to go down with running outside zone. We're going to go 4 wide and fill it up, and it's why they're at the Final Four.
And I will also submit, and I know this could potentially rub people the wrong way, I think Lisa's ability to coach Caitlin Clark. I think it hasn't been easy at times. Caitlin is very, very competitive. She's I'm not telling people anything they don't know. That have watched her play. We talked earlier about sometimes when the emotions get the best of her. I think Lisa and her staff have just done an outstanding job with helping Caitlin mature through the years and get the best out of her. And that's not easy to do. And they deserve credit for that.
In baseball and basketball at all levels, you've got to manage egos as much as you do situations. And especially when you're talking about somebody who is high strung, but is elite as Caitlin Clark, you've got to be able to go in and allow her to be her, but give her the constraints and the constructive criticism when necessary and discipline. And because there have been times, I even saw it a year ago, where, and I'm not even going to say who's on the floor. I can't remember exactly, but she was making a lot of post feeds, and they just weren't getting them because her passes are hard. I mean, they're football passes. They're so precise. And she looked over and she just kind of went, no five, just like, I'm not throwing to the five anymore. And then timeout, and Lisa sat her down and kind of reamed her for a minute or two, but she didn't force her to sit out for the whole game. She didn't force her to sit out for, until the next media timeout. She sat her over there for about 2 minutes. Then she went back in the game, and that was it. And yeah, you've got to manage that ego, kind of like, in the NBA or Major League Baseball, when you have superstars, you've got to manage those egos. And that's what Phil Jackson, for instance, why he was such a great coach. He had his style, he knew how to play, but he also knew how to manage Dennis Rodman and Michael Jordan. I mean,
Yeah.
And Lisa has been able to do the same thing. I mean, there are some players who are as coachable as, Megan Gustafson type. And then there are players, I'm not saying she's not, she is coachable, but Caitlin Clark does things her way and she does them well. But you've got to be able to go in and, provide that discipline if necessary. And she does. And it's just, and again, you've got to be unique. You've got to be able to do it and do it in a way where they don't get pissed off or want to transfer or F you. And to be able to do it and do it this long and is a skill that I'm glad she's getting her due.
And part of it is, being able to keep everybody on the roster understanding that everybody's moving in the same directions. When you have somebody that's a superstar that gets all the attention, that is, known worldwide, that can rub certain other teammates or whatever the wrong way. And Caitlin deserves credit for it too, because I think she's down to earth with her teammates. But again, the coaches being able to, for 4 years, being able to get the best out of Caitlin, but then get the best out of her supporting cast. Again, that's coaching, and it's not easy.
Yeah. I mean, can you imagine being, like a Monica Zanano or a Kate Martin, who feel like if you were on a different team, you would be the star, and yet they're able to get the most out of them and understand their role and play to their strengths. But, when those two, or McKenna Warnock especially, they're also kind of the enforcers of the team, that Kate Martin, everybody sees this otherworldly talent, but if she needs, I'll get her in her face, and give her the flexibility and the team the flexibility, to manage themselves. That's power. And because it can't be easy. It can't be easy if you're Gabby Marshall and you're a 3-point, superstar, and yet, I'm only getting a couple of shots in a game because you're asking me to play defense and make sure that this person over here gets all those shots. But she does it well. And, it's a skill that managing people. I remember being a boss once. For 6 years, I was a sports editor of a newspaper in Missouri. We had some very talented young people. We were full-time staff of 5 or 6, and then also, voila, they would leave, and trying to manage the people was much more difficult than saying, you cover this game or write this story. And I think that's the same deal here with Lisa, is not only providing that kind of leeway for Caitlin, but allowing the other people to feel like they're important too. And they all seem to do that. I mean, I'm sure there's a couple of people maybe on the bench who don't play a lot that probably may feel differently, but by and large, the ones that are on the floor getting it done, they all feel like they're pulling in the right direction.
Yeah, chemistry and culture have a lot to do with the coach. So, and the superstar. So both of those, Lisa and Caitlin, deserve a ton of credit there. So Well, Scott, we've run this out here, but I'm sure the people want to know how we feel things are going to go down in Cleveland this week. You and I won't meet again until next week after the championship game has been played. Um, I really, really like Iowa's chances against Connecticut. I think Iowa's a better team than Connecticut, but it's the Final Four, and you get a little bit sideways, as Fran is known to say. You get a little bit sideways, and it can cost you in a game like this. There's very little margin for error. I'm worried about South Carolina, though. I'm going to be completely honest with you. Having watched them throughout the season, they're big, they're long, they're talented, they defend their asses off. I want to say Iowa. My heart says Iowa, but I think I'm going to stick with South Carolina in a very, very hard fought national championship game.
I picked before the tournament. I was the only person at the Athletic to pick Iowa to go to the Final Four, and I had them getting beat by South Carolina, and I still do. And I had Connecticut in the Final Four as well, so I feel pretty good about that. I didn't have NC State.
Good job. Remember when nobody filled out women's basketball tournament brackets? There's another sign.
Yeah,
how far the game is coming.
Exactly. There's enough interest in it. And, I like the matchup for Iowa. As you said, it's easy to spot that on paper, and then you start to worry: am I too confident? What am I missing here? You've got two superstars going head to head, and you got two Hall of Fame coaches, probably regarded as the best, if not close to the best, in Gino Auriemma. And you know what? Lisa Bluder deserves her own freaking statue outside of Carver Hawkeye Arena. Maybe where we've got, the Dan Gable one's getting moved. Maybe they need to put one of Lisa Bluder right there.
Her and Caitlin. They can do a combo statue.
Exactly.
Have the national championship net around one's neck, and then the other one holding the national championship trophy.
Well, if they get there, if they win it.
That's what I'm saying. I'm being positive here.
Yeah,
Scott.
right.
Glass half full.
Right. Well, either way, they deserve it, and I think I got to pick South Carolina. I think. But that said, they're not invincible either. No. They've showed a couple of flaws in the tournament, but I think the thing with the South Carolina is that you wonder, not that they get bored, but what's their motivation and how do they let up at times? Like they may be looking ahead too in the Final Four. Maybe they're looking at, now, but then NC State is a team on their doorstep. It'd be like, what if Iowa was playing Missouri in the Final Four? And you're like, hey, you can't lose to them. They're a North Carolina team. They're not that far away. So, I would say NC State maybe could cause them more problems than a team like Iowa could, because they'll be absolutely motivated to beat Iowa. After beating them last year, even though all their starters are in the WNBA, it's Dawn Staley's still there, and she's as good as it gets. So, you know what, though? Ultimately, enjoy the moment, man. It doesn't happen very often. And when your team's in this position, just take soak it up, because maybe it happens, maybe it doesn't, but who knows? It's happened 3 times in Iowa history for the women's side and 3 times on the men's side. And the last women's one before last year was 1993, and they lost a heartbreaker then. So yeah, I'm going South Carolina, but when you got 22 on your team, you're never out of it.
You got a chance, no doubt. And Scott will send us off with the best advice we've gotten. Don't take any of this for granted, because this is a special time. I know it feels like you can do this every year, but it's really hard to do what Iowa's done the last 2 years, and soak it up. As Scott said, if you're going to Cleveland, have a great time, be careful, maybe check out the eclipse while you're there. You've got a shooting star in Caitlin Clark and eclipse coming to Cleveland. So should be a good show. And Friday, Sunday, I like it. I like that they're playing Friday, Sunday with the men going Saturday, Monday. I like that the women have first.
Yeah. Because at one point it was Sunday, Tuesday, and that almost felt anticlimactic when it was Tuesday. And it's not their fault. It's just kind of the way, one shining moment, the men's tournament, it kind of concludes it. And it's like, is this an encore or is this,
Yeah.
I like the fact that it's Sunday. I mean, I think if it was a little bit later in the afternoon, I think it might be better. But that said, it is what it is. And I think Friday night's going to be electric in Cleveland. I think it'll be as electric as we've ever seen.
Looking forward to it. I'm sure all of you are as well. Scott's heading out there. I don't think I am. I may, still kind of up in the air, but I'll be watching and keeping track of what's going on and enjoying this moment in time of Hawkeye history. And I think that's the best part. And I think everybody should soak this Hawkeye history up, because you'll be able to tell future grandchildren, generations, that you witnessed this, and that's something special. So enjoy it. And we appreciate you listening to the podcast and adjusting with us this week. As I said, we'll do the mailbag on Thursday instead of Tuesday, flip-flop this week. Scott and I hopefully will be back next Thursday for the podcast. We probably will have some access to Iowa football. We'll talk about what happened this weekend, get into some more spring football, and plenty to talk about. There's never a dull moment around here. So thank you, everybody, for listening. Thank you to our sponsors, and we will talk to you next week. Say goodbye, Scott.
Goodbye, Scott.